NSA, and other agencies. It covers leave provided between January 31st and September 30th of this year, up to 40 hours per week at appropriate rates, according to DoD. The statute says, I think, minimum applicable rates. Although agencies initially had the view that they could pay fee or profit as well as the cost on those rates, that view has now changed, and DoD is taking the position that no fee or profit is permitted, and we believe that other agencies are going to take a similar view. Companies cannot double dip. In other words, they can't have PPP loans forgiven for costs that they're also compensated for under 3610. They can't have the same costs covered by Families First Coronavirus Response Act tax credit, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and 3610, or under any other state or local program that receives compensation. So companies that receive money under 3610 that later have a PPP loan forgiven for the same costs may have to return some money to the government. And one other important provision of 3610 is that these costs have to be segregated and identifiable in a contractor's records. So, like everything that we're talking about today, document everything, in as much detail as you can, entitlement to 3610, and so on, to make sure that when the audits come, and they will come, our government is spending trillions and trillions of dollars right now with little time for debate and consideration, sort of the safeguards on these programs. So the safeguard is going to come after the fact, and it's going to be audits to confirm that people were eligible for these programs and use the money appropriately. The last thing I want to mention in new authorities is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That legislation created a new sick leave requirement for small businesses. Up to 2 weeks of leave for COVID-19 related illness, or caring for children who are home from school because of COVID-19, or caring for relatives who had COVID-19. And it provided that the costs providing that sick leave would be fully reimbursable to businesses through payroll tax credits. Of course, that meant it was resulting basically a loan from small businesses to the federal government to cover those costs, because the payroll tax credits wouldn't be returned until the next quarter, and then whenever the government got around to processing your tax filings. So the CARES Act addressed that by allowing an advance payment of the tax credit, and I think that was a useful mechanism for refunding that amount. So to make that costless to small businesses. And the last topic I want to cover is that, as I said, investigations are coming. The CARES Act created a new Special Inspector General for Pandemic Relief, or the SEGPER. It's modeled on the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program funds during the financial crisis, or the SEGTARP. I think the SEGPER is going to be active. As I said, the federal government can't inject trillions of dollars into the economy without there being some fraud. I suspect that there's going to be a lot of well-intentioned misuse of the funds as well. Not because companies are trying to intentionally defraud the government, because things are moving quickly and people are scrambling to keep their companies afloat. But it highlights that all applications and representations have to be accurate as companies are applying for loans and other types of relief. There will be False Claims Act and false statements risk, and I think the SEGPER will be going after misrepresentations. DOJ has already announced that they want all U.S. attorneys' offices across the country to have a point person in their office for pandemic response fraud, So we're advising all clients to carefully follow the rules of the programs under which funds are received. Receiving those funds may require that your company put in place new policies or procedures, and carefully document and track the use of any funds so you can later prove how they were used. For example, if your company's received a PPP loan, we strongly recommend that you set up a separate account, a segregated account for those funds, and track every dollar that comes out of that account carefully. That'll help you in the forgiveness application that will be coming this fall, and also in responding to any audit if one should occur. Well, with that, I've pretty much covered the material I wanted to touch on today, and I'm happy to take some questions if folks have anything they want to.
So, Richard, what I'd like to do is just cover some of the things that you were talking about and get a little bit more information.
Sure.
I think that people have responded by communicating with their contracting officers, and that's working well. I think the one that I wrote down as most important was documentation of being able to show what the cost and schedule impacts are going to be, because my concern is going to be how will companies do equitable adjustments and things like that. And my biggest concern is for the subcontractors under these. The primes protect themselves, obviously, but the subs have less leverage and less access to legal advice to do that. So can you tell me a little bit about a way that you're working with subcontractors, or what you're telling them to look for? And specifically, I'm looking for people in professional services, since that's really the largest base of the group that we all work with.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for that question, Jenny. And I think subcontractors' entitlement to equitable adjustments is going to be driven primarily by the contract. And as a sub, there are sort of two buckets that you're going to be looking at for types of claims or equitable adjustments. And one is equitable adjustments that for which the prime contractor is responsible, and the other are equitable adjustments for which the government would be responsible for paying, sort of a sponsored claim. And I've seen a lot of subcontracts that split those into two categories and have different procedures governing requesting relief from the prime. So if the government is the cause of the delay, you may have one certain set of procedures you've got to follow. If the prime is responsible for the delay and the cost impact, you may have another set. So I think the first thing I would recommend is carefully review your contract. If the government has, for instance, shut down a facility or created barriers to your workforce from getting to the facility, make sure you know what is required in your contract for requesting those costs. In terms of tracking those costs and making sure you have adequate support for your claim, I mean, I think you'd go about it the same way you would if you were a prime contractor. Make sure, if there has been a shutdown order in your state, make sure you've got the documentation from the state authorities in your files that show what you're required to do. If you're not an essential business, make sure you track that as well. And your accounting, this is an opportunity perhaps to make sure that you've got adequate tracking of labor hours and so on.
Well, and generally what I do is tell people to set up separate charge numbers and separate accounts and track it. I tell them to be very careful about saving every single correspondence and the other, so they know exactly where it is. The other thing that I thought that you described very well was what you called an existential crisis.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's going to be changes in our industry as a result of that. And I think the biggest concern is over subs not being able to perform. And it's a bad thing because there's going to be companies that do have bankruptcy. It's going to be, on the other hand, opportunities for companies that are prepared to step in. And I guess I just want to know your philosophy of how it's going to change the federal contracting landscape.
I think that's a great question, and difficult to predict where it's going to go. I mean, I suspect one thing that's going to happen is we're going to see a lot more remote working, not just in the federal contracting workforce, but across the entire economy. I think this crisis has shown people that they can be as efficient and effective, for the most part, working from home as they can working in the office. So I think we'll see a lot more opportunities for telecommuting. It may be it may be more challenging for a time for small businesses that don't have the funding and the liquidity to ride the crisis out. Hopefully, some of the relief that I talked about in 3610 or the PPP loans are helping small businesses to get through it. And I should point out that 3610 expressly states that it covers both contractors and subcontractor employees who are being maintained in a ready state. So if you're a sub being impacted by the government not allowing people to the work site for a time, make sure you have this conversation with the prime contractor, because the prime is going to be talking to the contracting officer about it. And if the prime has employees in a ready state and getting compensated under 3610 as a subcontractor, you ought to be as well. But I think the primary change, Jenny, going forward is that we're going to see a lot more remote work by all types of companies.
Well, and I think it's going to change the pricing. of how these got started and how you prepare. But the other thing that I was concerned about is those employees that have security clearances that work in government buildings, and what kind of delays have you seen happening in the industry because of that?
That's a very good question. I think companies that have facility clearances, we're seeing employees still getting to the workspace. For government facilities where cleared employees are going to work and can only work in that space, whether it's because it's NSA cleared or what have you, I've seen delays because the government is trying to reduce the labor force density in government facilities. And so, I mentioned earlier a client that has half of their workforce going in one week and the other half going in the following week on a major contract that's got some classified issues involved in the contract. And so I'm seeing that sort of impact, that even on vital national security requirements, the government's still taking steps to reduce the risk to their workforce of COVID-19.
Well, and the last question I wanted to ask before we wrap up was about those companies that are in cybersecurity. And I feel like what it's really pointed out is, are we prepared to work as a nation electronically and on remotes and things like that? It's also pointed out a lot of gaps and holes.
Yeah.
So cybersecurity, any comments on that?
Well, I think we're prepared now. And I think that includes Zoom. I understand this platform is more secure than it was a month ago when communications and encryption were being funneled through servers in China. I think we probably have some way to go to make sure that this platform and others are totally secure. I think the measures the government is taking to, particularly DoD, to secure the contractor workforce and ensure cybersecurity measures are spread through the supply chain are moving forward. Those efforts are going to be slowed, right? Because you're not going to be able to have auditors coming in to certify companies. They can't come into the workspace. And we will see. I know some states have lifted some of those restrictions effective today. But I think those measures will continue. But we may see a little bit of a change in pace because of the difficulty in getting people into offices.
Well, I really appreciate, Richard, your being here to talk to us about these today. I know that we're going to have Todd Overman come back again on the 12th with more on our legal issues. And I just wanted to have one last thing. Emily, last week you reported that you were talking to about the CMMC and the delays and things like that. It still seems like it's on track. You want to unmute and talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I would just highly recommend following the DoD in terms of what they're saying. And I was just saying that a couple weeks ago, I didn't see any indication of delay. I haven't seen a change in that, and I haven't not seen a change. I haven't really followed it in the past 2 weeks. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, anyway, thank you all for being a part of Freedom Friday. We'll be doing this again next Friday at 1300. We've got Brian Butler coming up with Vistor Technology. We've got Gable Ruiz with Advanced IT Concept. And Russ Barnes, you're going to be on May 22nd. Can you unmute for a minute and just tell people about what your session is going to be about?
So the idea is that in these times, people are having extra time to take a look at things. And my session is going to talk about how you take a step back and look at your business strategically and what type of framework you can use to actually make that happen. Because in a lot of times people will say, look at your business strategically, but what does that actually mean? So we're going to use a framework of mission mapping to explore that, and then people will be able to use it as they see best, as it fits best for their circumstances and their companies.
I think that's really going to be helpful because a lot of people's game plan 6 months ago is completely turned upside down, and there are new opportunities as well. So thank you all. Have a great Friday, and I will look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks very much, Sammy. Thanks, everyone.